Chapter 7 The Journey Back Home. Dogon Ronda. In Bulaknan, canyons covered most of the countryside. And even after riding for over 50 miles, there were hardly any trees around. When Sisis rose and Luna and Risa joined in to reflect Sisis's heat, my body began to sweat profusely. Lamare was just a few yards to my right. The shawl that she used to tie me up yesterday covered her head, and all I could see now were her eyes and the tip of her nose. I offered Lamare my coat, but she refused. I told her that it would protect her from the sun, but she replied that I needed protection just the same. I knew she meant nothing more than what she said, but it made me feel warm all over. Lamare stopped in her tracks. I don't understand. It only took me half a day to get to Bulaknan, but we've been riding for almost a day, and we're still inside this province. She sounded worried. I looked around. That was a keen observation. Well, not exactly keen, I should have noticed it first, but because I was paying attention to something I found more endearing, I lost track of time. We're not riding hard this time, I said. Nobody's chasing me, she said, somewhat smiling as she glanced at me. I was unsure if she was kidding, but the shawl covering her mouth moved, and I caught a slight upturn of her lips. If we ride harder, we might still be able to make it back to Wawang village without having to spend another night here, I said. Lamare dismounted and pulled at her bay. Then under the heat of the sun, she sat down. It looked as if there was nothing left for me to do as well, and this posed an excellent opportunity to get another chance to talk to her. Naturally, I dismounted too. I took extra care to leave a good 3 paces between us, though, just in case she grew uneasy about the situation. Her eyes were squinting. Is something wrong? I asked. She looked at me and said, It's my son. I pray to the gods he's all right. I forgot about the boy. He'll be fine. That's why I have to be home soon. Thank goodness for these horses. They may be tired and hungry already, but they still serve us. When she said hungry, my stomach growled. Why did you follow me? She asked. I couldn't see her face with my back turned, and from the tone of her voice, I couldn't guess what she must have been feeling. I got curious, I said. There were plenty of reasons why I followed her, but the most important reason was the one I couldn't tell her about. What's your plan? I said after a while. She played with the horse's reins as she spoke. I'm going to run away from the Emperor. He can't make me right if he can't find me. I'll take my son. Where will you go? I said in a rush. She shook her head, and the shawl covering her mouth fell off, revealing her lips. With the sun's heat, her lips only grew redder, and with the sweat that covered her face, she looked even lovelier than a goddess after a steam bath. I don't know yet. My son Kino is helping me figure out a place to go to, but, she paused and laughed nervously before shaking her head. There's something I still have to do. There was a certain heaviness upon my chest that I was unaccustomed to. All I knew was that I didn't want Lamare to go. Without the scrolls to present to the Emperor, I wouldn't have any reason to see her. What do you have to do? I asked after a moment. I couldn't be selfish. Lamare looked thoughtful for a moment and fidgeted with the reins again. I had to give up something in the past. The trouble was, it wasn't even mine to give up. Now I have to take it back, she said. Was I too taken by her to understand what she was saying, or was she actually talking in riddles? What is it? Lamare shrugged. I have to figure it out myself. I wanted to help, but if she wouldn't tell me, then there's nothing I could do, right? I didn't want to see her so cloaked in so much melancholy. There must be something I could do to make her smile. I turned my back at her, and on the space in front of me, I patted the ground. From where my hand landed, a plant slowly sprouted and continued growing until a flower appeared. I stared at a red rose. Some of the petals were already opened, but the flower was still mostly a bud. It looked as if it bloomed at the perfect moment. I plucked it out at the stem. I had second thoughts before I finally decided to turn around and hand it to Lamare. Maybe this will cheer you up, I said, wanting to kick myself for whatever it was I was doing. She looked at the rose and laughed. Where in the world did you get this? She took it and smelled it like any other woman would. It was right here, where we sat. But there's no sign of water anywhere near. I didn't think it could grow here. Oops. I blushed again. It was just there, right at our backs. She smiled. It doesn't matter where it came from, she said. It's beautiful. Not as beautiful as you are. This flower, she said, makes me happy. It made me happy, too. Looking at her, a realization hit me. Sometimes we tend to love the ones we could never have. I looked down and felt ashamed about my thoughts. Just then, from where we were sitting, we started hearing receding footsteps. Did you hear that? She asked, obviously cautioned. It seems like it's moving, but I don't see anything. There, she pointed to the east, lowering her voice. Look, there seems to be something moving around. It could just be the wind. Did you feel any breeze? No. Then it couldn't be the wind, she said sternly as she stood up. Hold the reins. Lamare ran towards the source of the sound, but there didn't seem to be anything there anymore. I followed her. Did you find anything? Lamare shook her head. She was still holding the flower. We should go now if we want to reach Canela in the evening, I said. She agreed and took the reins back, mounting her horse. As she did, the flower fell to the ground. I bent down to pick it up. There were some strange marks on the ground, like there were a few sets of footsteps. I looked farther. It was difficult to see the steps because they seemed so light, and if I weren't looking closely, I would have missed them. Lamare, I said. Look. She immediately climbed down and knelt beside me. Footsteps? Looks like it to me. Who could these footsteps belong to? Do you think they were what we heard earlier? I stood up and gave back the rose to Lamare. She looked up at me. Ghosts, she whispered. What do you mean? They are the only ones who can walk this lightly. The ghosts were here. I don't understand. Stop talking in riddles, I said, growing frustrated. No, Dogen. I'm not talking in riddles. Lamare crouched and inspected the ground before us. Look, these are footsteps. There's no doubt about it. I know of a clan who can walk so lightly, Nivens. Nivens? I said in disbelief. They are long gone. I know. But they are the only ones who could walk this way. They are very discreet people. Then why didn't we see them? Lamare paused and then turned to me. Because they can turn invisible. Unbelievable. I said. I wanted to say more, but I couldn't think of better words to say. Then, something pulled at my reins. It seemed like Luya wanted to run away. But the odd thing was that the horse seemed to be as shocked by her movements as I was. I pulled her rein so that she would be closer to me, but she didn't move. Instead, Luya moved farther away. What's wrong? I asked Luya. Then she walked backward. Could a horse even walk backward? What the? Lamare looked up. What's wrong? She was already mounted on her horse, and the rose tucked to her belt. This horse is acting strangely. Luya kept on pulling at me. I threw my arms up in exasperation. What do you want? I yelled. At that moment, Luya turned around and sauntered away as though her legs were being dragged. Then at a faster pace, she galloped. After a few yards, I saw a man climb the saddle. He was bald, and the sun shone on his shaved head. Thanks for the horse, he yelled as he galloped away, leaving me shocked about what happened. Hey! Lamare shouted as she rode after the man. I ran after them. Lamare was still ahead of me even as I tried pushing myself to my limits. My left knee still slowed me down. Lamare, no! I yelled as the earth erupted meters away from where she was. Lamare pulled at the reins quickly enough, veering her bay sharply to the left. Then she halted, coughing as the cloud of dust began to engulf her. When I reached her, The dust had started to dissipate. Lamare's eyes were red and watery. "Are you all right?" I asked. "Your horse," she began. "We must go after the thief." "It's gone," I said. I could no longer see the thief, and the galloping sound had long been gone. "There are more important things than a horse. We should head back home now." "I don't think we're still that far back. I could walk from here." "All right," she said. "I hope you have your heart set on taking a long hike."
Kino Amark. Focus. That's what I needed to do, but with this heat, it was a surprise that Dogen and I could still think straight. Or maybe we had stopped doing that because instead of trying a second time to run after the horse thief, we gave up so quickly. It was probably an intelligent decision just the same. As Dogen had pointed out, he would not be able to catch up with the old thief anyway. My throat was still sore from coughing as well. I became more confident the more I thought about it. That earth erupting in front of me left me quite shaken. And with that distance from the old man, it only confirmed how strong our horse thief's power was. I stopped and turned the horse around. "Are you all right?" Dogen seemed sunburned already. Sweat coursed down his cheeks from the shaved parts of his head. The top knot looked better on him than his old haircut. "Don't worry about me. My feet are burning at the soles, but I'm good," Dogen said. I nodded and started trotting on the horse. Maybe if I let some distance separate us, a few yards perhaps, I could force Dogen to move faster, and we would reach Wawang sooner. I had two options in mind for a hiding place, Direla and Nivatan. Direla was a long way from Canela, and since the disaster, we could quietly enter the province and seek out some help to build a small cottage for us, probably along the coastline. Nivatan, though, was a peculiar choice. Why would Kino even want to stay there? True, the place would shelter us, and it had been uninhabited for a long time now. We could stay there for moon turns before we even get discovered by any of the palace soldiers. And in case Wind decided to send a search party for Kino and me, which I'm positive he would do, by that time, assuming that I had released Kino from the bind of his powers, maybe, the two of us could fight Wind. So many what-ifs and maybes. The only problem was that I had no power without Wind making the words I write come true. "Can we camp here for a while?" Dogen asked, panting. I stopped and looked up at the sky. It was already dark. "We have no food." "Exactly," he said. "If we use up all our energy now, it will be more difficult tomorrow." "Oh, Kino. Please wait for me. Don't be worried. I'm coming home tomorrow." "All right," I said. "Really?" Dogen sounded very surprised. I dismounted my bay and gave Dogen the reins. Sometimes, I still remember him as the stable boy from the palace back when I was the princess of Canela. I walked a few yards before I sat down. The ground was as hot as ever, but I knew it would begin to cool down as soon as Sisis set. Dogen was standing back with the horse, his face a picture of confusion. "What?" I asked. "Do I know you from somewhere in the past?" he asked. "It's just that this feels familiar. Like the way you handed me the reins and the way I took them without another word. And your face." My eyes widened. Could he remember some memories of me? About my past? That would mean that the words I wrote wore off with time. What about my face? Dogen regarded me carefully before shrugging his shoulders. "I am not certain. But sometimes, I feel like I know your face." He then blushed furiously. I sighed as my hope of someone remembering who I was dissolved into thin air. "Come sit with me." When he didn't move, I added, "We'd better rest now." He nodded and moved towards me, the horse trailing after him. Before he sat beside me, though, he crouched down near a boulder and worked his way to tie up the horse. "Have you decided where you'll be hiding?" he asked. "I have a few options, but I paused, looked at Dogen, and fell silent. He chuckled. "Of course. You won't tell me because you think I'll go running to tell the Emperor. You're his man-shield. You always go with him. That makes you in the best position to reveal everything about me." "And why, pray tell, would I do that to you?" "I know now that you're not a witch," he said. He tried to hold my gaze. I was the first one to look away. Could I trust this man when I knew so little about him? It's all right. I understand, he said, releasing me from my dilemma. I miss my son, I whispered, not meaning for Dogen to hear. I should not open up to him like this. Shaking my head, I tried to change the topic. What about you? Married? Children? Dogen smiled. With this face, no woman would ever dare look my way, he said, his throaty laughter filling the air. My heart went out to him. Come on, it's not that bad, I said before I could stop myself. You're actually, I racked my brains for the right adjective to describe the way he looks. You don't have to be so kind, he interjected. Please. No, I protested. You're strangely different. I think by saying that, I made the situation worse. Dogen shook his head, his eyes shining with mirth. It's all right, really, he said. I bowed my head and blushed. Then what happened next surprised me. When I looked up, he was holding out another red rose for me. Where did you get this? I asked, confused. Flowers grow everywhere, he said. He gave me a similar flower in the morning even though there was no rose bush anywhere near where we sat. And here, I knew there was no flowering plant around. The land was so dry that no shrub could thrive there. But when I looked at our backs, sure enough, a rose bush was there. Thank you, I said, accepting the rose. Is there someone special? He smiled timidly. Come on, tell me, I pushed. There's nothing better to do here. He looked at me. I've been in love once. A long time ago. But it was too far back in my memory that I can't remember if it ever did happen, he started. It feels like a fairy tale. I was a young stable boy when I fell in love with a beautiful princess. But she was already married. And then I don't know, can't explain, what happened. He shrugged his shoulders. Just like that, I could no longer remember her face, even her name. Sometimes he paused. His eyes were looking far away now, his eyebrows drawn in a straight line as though he was trying to remember something. Sometimes, I think that maybe I just made it all up. That there was no princess to begin with. And I, the fool that I am, hang on to that memory for lack of something real. I gave a start. He did remember the fragments of my memories, although not the entire story. It seems there are traces of my existence in Akea's minds, but sadly I had no name and no face in them. My throat constricted as I tried to swallow my emotions. Here was a man who held on to my memory. Someone who had meant nothing to me in the past, and yet somehow, I have ended up haunting his thoughts. I was touched by what he said, especially knowing all too well that the we he wanted could not have progressed in any manner. I paused as I caught my voice breaking. I breathed in, closed my eyes for a while, and when I was ready, opened my mouth again. Is there somebody new now? I asked. He opened his mouth like he was about to say something, but he stopped. The flowers. The chase. Was he mad at me, or was he concerned about me? If memory could make him remember the feeling of love, was it possible that seeing me every fortnight could make him fond of me again? Suddenly I understood. I touched his hand, and he blushed. It could be that I was the only woman he ever did love. Still loves. Thank you for the flowers, I said and squeezed his hand. His blush ran a deeper crimson this time. He shook his head and said, It's nothing. Flowers are ordinary, they're part of nature, of the land. Especially roses. They grow everywhere. I stopped. Dear gods. I think Dogen may have handed me the solution to my dilemma, of how I would release Kino from the bond. Without thinking, I threw my arms around Dogen and hugged him so tightly that even with his size, I was afraid I would crush him to pieces. What the? He seemed to want to object, but I didn't let go of him. Dogen, you are wonderful. I breathed against his ear. Then I pulled back. Thank you, I said, giving him my best smile. He looked confused, and his face was all red, but his eyes were shining luminously like Luna and Risa. You have eyes as beautiful as the moon's, I said. I did not say that to make him feel better. Indeed, as I looked into his eyes, I could not have made a more fitting comparison. He looked away, scarlet still staining his dark cheeks. I kissed him on his left cheek as a sign of my gratitude. He was unsure of what he did, but he could not have picked out better words to say to me. Before he could react, I lay myself down on the ground and smiled at him. Good night, Dogen. I closed my eyes and drifted into sleep. This time, the nightmares did not haunt me anymore. Instead, in my dreams, I saw life for Kino and me in Nijveden. Living in one of the tree houses. Waiting for Kino's father, who would never come back, but not even that dampened the dream. It remained splendid.
Dogen Rhonda. Now, that was strange. True, I couldn't have reveled more in that hug, but I wished I knew why Lamare embraced me. It was as though I saved her life. Not that I would ever complain about the hug, but I wish I knew what I did right. I stood up and patted her bay. Poor horse. Don't worry, tomorrow you can have all the grass you can eat, I told the horse. It regarded me as though annoyed that I had bothered its sleep. I went back beside Lamare and watched as her chest slowly rose and fell. If I were Kino and my mother had gone missing for 2 days, I would have panicked. But that's just half the problem. The other half was that the Emperor could be looking for me too. If I came back now, would he brand me a deserter for leaving without asking for his permission? Lately, the Emperor had been preoccupied with many things, and so I hoped I still had a job to go back to. I wanted to follow Lamare to where she would hide. She didn't know it, but I was willing to protect her even from the Emperor himself. Wait a minute, just when did this treasonous thought enter my head? I closed my eyes and remembered a memory from a long time ago, of an arrow piercing my back, of myself trying to remove it, and of soft hands yanking the arrow out, Her Royal Highness who had no face. Somehow, no, this is crazy. I didn't want to say it, but, sometimes Lamare reminded me of the princess. My princess? Or maybe it was only because of the way I felt about the princess before. And how I felt towards Lamare now. The princess. Lamare. I thumped my head twice to shake my thoughts. There's no sense thinking about this cratty thing. I lay down a few yards away from Lamare and closed my eyes to sleep. Kino Amark. Piper had stirred in bed, and she opened her eyes briefly before I left Nijveden. Her forehead was still burning, but there was nothing left for me to do in the ghost town. Piper would be cared for by Mistress Laren, and I knew for a fact that mothers simply work wonders when their children are sick. In due time, Piper's wound would heal. The thought, though, was not satisfying enough. I wanted Piper to be up and about, right this very moment. The fact that I was the reason she had gotten sick in the first place made me feel like a sharp stick was poking my heart, the kind Mayo would use to poke frogs in the stream near Wawang village. If she had not run out to save me from the falling treehouse, I could have been the one lying in bed now, or I could have been paralyzed, or worse, I could have died. I looked beside me and found Kogi staring straight ahead. He was as quiet as that evening's gentle breeze. Nivens blend well with their surroundings even when they are visible, I suppose. Master Andoni could not leave the town, so he had asked Kogi to escort me back to my village. I protested at first because I did not want that kind of favor, but Master Andoni was insistent, especially when he said that I had to be invisible so I would be safe in case we came across some wanderers. Sadly, the only way I could turn invisible was if a Niven shared his power with me. Kogi and I ended up having to climb down the mountains together. He scowled at me because I sensed that he did not want to leave Piper's side. But he was unable to object because of this thing Nivens called Nameless, a name forsaken, something whose meaning I could not exactly recall, except that the way Master Andoni commanded Kogi seemed as if he had no right to object at all. I hope to learn more about Niven's ways in the future. Why is it that you can only turn one person invisible? I asked Kogi, wanting to start a conversation. After all, he was Piper's friend. Kogi shook his head. I don't know exactly. The elders say that it used to be that only women could do that. Women? Why? They say that it's a gift from the gods so that they can protect the babies when they are still too young to protect themselves. Then how come men can also make someone else invisible now? I don't know. Maybe for battles. But it's limited, you see. We can only extend our power to one person, and we have to be in constant physical contact with the person we want to share our power with, he said. He glanced at me sideways as we walked at a fast pace. Come, give me your hand, he said. Kogi stopped beside me. I extended my hand to him and saw myself disappear before my very eyes. Keep quiet and listen to your surroundings, he said in a hushed voice. We're very close to the border of your village, and there could be people wandering about. I followed his lead. I breathed in the scent that was canela. It was good to be back in Wawang. I think you're safe here. Follow Master Andoni's instructions in case you need to come back to Nivedan, he said, letting go of my hand and vanishing into thin air. Suddenly, I found myself alone again. I started walking my way home, and in a few minutes, I saw our cottage. There was a horse on the lawn. Could it be? Was my mother back? I broke into a sprint as the desire to find out if mother was home beckoned at me. I was gasping for breath when I reached the cottage, but I did not slow down. I threw the door open. Mother? I shouted. A woman was sitting on the bench inside our hut. Who are you? I asked. That's of no importance to you, she said. Her eyes traveled over my body as though scrutinizing me. You don't look like the emperor at all. What? I asked, confused. I wonder how you could be so important to him, she said. What's your power? She asked. I have no power, I said without batting an eye. I surprised myself at my own candor. Curious thing, she said, her eyebrows raised. She still had not risen from the bench, and looking at her there with her regal bearing, I grew afraid. No power? Nothing. Everybody in Akea has power, she said. Do not lie to me, boy. I will know it when you lie. If I tell you otherwise, I would be lying. The woman stood up from where she was. Her eyes took me in as she walked towards me. Then without warning, she put her hand on my forehead. Flashes ran inside my head. It was like a multitude of bright lights blinded me as the raging winds blew and lightning split the sky. Then it felt as though I was floating. Flying. Running really fast. Dreaming? It soon felt as though I would burn right on the spot, and my body started to quiver until I yelled, and the woman was shrieking too. She pulled back from touching me, and both of us were thrown back a fair distance. We ended up lying on the floor across from each other. What was that? She asked in a soft voice, addressing the question to herself and not to me. What did you do to me? I asked, suddenly growing more afraid. My body was shaking, and I could not stop my voice from cracking up. Nothing, she said hesitantly. I don't know what happened. I stood on shaky knees and reached out a hand to her. The woman eyed me warily before taking my hand. When her hand met mine, we both flinched. I exhaled loudly when nothing happened. And your mother? She asked. What? What is your mother's ability? After what just happened, are you still going to ask things about me? I asked, surprised. Looking at her face, there was no trace of surprise anymore, as though what happened between us a while ago did not merit further looking into. Answer me, she said. And as though I could not resist her, I did. My mother writes. I think she can write compelling stories. That's all she can do. I had no intentions of telling her anything more, but it was as though the words were being dragged out of my mouth. A writer, she said. She seemed to be mulling on everything I said. Who are you? I asked with a bit of an edge in my voice. She raised her eyebrows again. It's of no consequence to you, boy. Then what are you doing here? I said and added, just leave, too bad my voice cracked again. She raised her eyebrows higher. My lady, I added as an afterthought. She laughed at that. Tell me one more thing before I leave, she said, and then she looked deeply into my eyes. Who is your father? My face flushed upon hearing that question. Not having power was not my only disadvantage. Not knowing who my father was added to my list of insecurities. I blinked several times to push back tears. I don't know, I said, almost whispering. Her face registered an emotion I could not quite make out. Then, she stood up. Goodbye, Kino. She started walking towards the door. I watched as she mounted the horse and galloped away. My heart was now beating wildly. Who was she? She terrified me, and her knowing my name made me tremble even more. I went back inside the cottage and closed the door, disappointed and very unsettled. I thought my mother would be home, but instead, I found a stranger in the cottage. Things were starting to get more unusual, and I did not understand any of these things. I pushed open the door that led to my room and went straight under the bed to hide. Here was where I had always taken refuge when things bothered me. I dozed off, and the next thing I knew, it was my mom's face that I was seeing. I reached to touch her face to convince myself it was not a dream. "Mother," I said, disbelief coating my voice. She was smiling at me with misty eyes. I crawled from under the bed and squeezed her so hard in a hug. She was holding me so tightly, too, as though she never wanted to let go. "What happened?" I asked. "Dogan Rhonda and I went on a journey together," she said, and looked at the tall man with a wide frame who was standing by the door. He was so tall and wide that it was almost unbelievable that I did not notice him before seeing Mother. "Did he take you captive?" I scowled. The huge man had a face that drove fear straight into my chest. Mother ruffled my hair. "No, silly. Well, at first, he chased me for a little while, but I was too fast for him," she said, then turning to the man, "Wasn't I, Dogan?" "Is he the enemy?" I asked, not taking my gaze off of him. I stood up and used myself as a human shield for my mother. Dogan smiled, if anyone could ever call that a smile. "Kino, I'm a friend." I looked at my mother, and she nodded. "We have to go now." "Someone," I stopped and looked at Dogan. Then, to my mother, I said, "I need to talk to you alone." Dogan seemed to understand, so he slowly made his way out of the cottage. "Mother, we can go to the ghost town. Please," I begged. "Someone has agreed to take us in." "What?" she asked. Her eyes grew wide. "What are you saying?" "There are no ghosts. At least not in that town. They are Nivens hiding from Akeens." Mother sat down on my bed, her hands shaking. "I met Piper, a girl, a Niven, and well, she became my friend. When you went missing, I went back to Ghost Town and asked her father to take us into his household." She looked up at me. "And?" I grinned. "He agreed." Mother paled. "What? You've overstepped your bounds, young man," she said, annoyed, although looking more concerned than annoyed. She stood and walked away from me and started walking in circles the way she did when she was thinking really, really hard. "Go back to school, enjoy your youth while it lasts, and leave the planning to me," she said. "But it's perfect for us," I argued. I was sure she would see sense in it all and agree. Mother stopped and looked at me before throwing her arms in exasperation. "I'll think it over. This is too much. Everybody knows that Nivedon is a ghost town inhabited by ghosts, and now you're telling me it's not?" I gaped at her. "You speak like you know the place." "Of course." "You've been there?" Then, as the realization hit me, I said again, "Oh. You've been there." Nivedon was a part of my life when I was growing up. I witnessed its vanishing. "I lost friends to the flood that destroyed it," she said. "Now, you're telling me that there are survivors?" "I'm sorry, Mother," I said softly. "I didn't know you had friends there." She sat back on the bed and held her face in her hands. "Please, Kino. Leave me for a while. I need to think about this." Without another word, I obeyed. Her slumped shoulders made her frame even tinier. I felt a stabbing pain in my chest. I thought she would be happy when she heard my news. This was not the reaction I was hoping for. I turned towards the door, and as I walked outside, I caught sight of Boots walking away. I narrowed my eyes. I should never trust Dogan.
Lamari Amark. My hands were trembling. Nivens? Alive? What about Timbuktu? Was there any chance that he could still be alive, too? But the words that I had written to make him come back to me were met with empty silence. That means he could not be. He never will be again. Tears were already streaming down my face. The memory of the Nivens took me back to a very specific place and time, when I was still young, when my father was still alive, and when I was in love with a man who was not my husband. I dried my tears. This had to stop. I had mourned Timbuk Blassus a long time ago. He gave me the best gift in this world, a son. I should not let his memory weaken me, especially after I had figured out a way to release Kino from the bond. But I could not stop my hands from shaking, and when I stood up, my knees buckled. I found myself kneeling on the floor, and since I had no strength to stand up, I succumbed to crying once more. I miss you, Timbuk. So it could be true then. Those soft footsteps that we saw in Bulaknin belonged to Nivens. What could they be doing out there so far away from Nivedon? Confused as I was, I had to be stronger now for Kino and myself. Direla or Nivedon? I had considered both as a safe haven, that is true. Nivedon seemed to be the better choice, but that was before I knew that the Nivens were alive. Could I even go back there? Nobody would remember me. I had been written off from their memories when wind stripped me from everybody's minds. If I saw familiar faces, some friends who are still alive, would I be able to take it if none acknowledged me with even a smile? It is hard enough that Timbuk would not be there, but for all the other Nivens whom he had entrusted me with their friendship, for them to regard me coldly. I am unsure if I can handle that. But what now? Since I had already figured out a way to release Kino, it was more pressing that I decide where to hide. Nivens were my friends. They were quiet people, and their honor ran deeply. If someone had accepted Kino and me into their household, then we could count on them for protection. But would I dare endanger them again? The first time they suffered was out of Wind's whim, as a display of his power all over Akea. This time, in case Wind finds me gone and he learns I am in Nivedon, it would be upon my conscience that I bring his wrath to Nivedon. Again. And it could end even worse this time, with all of the Nivens eradicated from the face of Akea. Oh my gods, why do you burden me with this dilemma? I shivered and hugged myself close, not minding the tears that continued to roll down my cheeks, creating a small pool on the bedroom floor. I soon looked up, and there, standing by the doorway, was Dogen. He approached me in 2 strides and, upon reaching me, knelt, scooped me in his arms, and carried me. I thought that he would put me in bed. Instead, what he did surprised me. He sat down on the edge of the bed while still cradling me in his arms and continued to hold me, his chin resting on top of my head. It felt good to have some sense of security again. It was with this thought that sobs racked my body for the next hour or so.
Dogen Rhonda. When Kino came out of the room, I went back inside to say goodbye to Lamare. I had stayed with her for too long a time already, and I needed to report back to the palace. But when I reached the door, Lamare was kneeling, crying her heart out. I had never known emotion so raw, except for that time when I had to let go of another woman to die. And the death that followed. Still, I couldn't stand seeing Lamare crying like that. However, this time, I remembered to keep my mouth shut, and I let her sob against my shoulders. That was hours ago. And now, as I stood outside gazing at the skyline that had already darkened, I waited for the right moment to say goodbye. Lamare was locked in her room, finishing her scroll and making up for the lost days she promised to write for the Emperor. I decided that I couldn't wait anymore. I had to leave soon, so I entered the cottage again and stopped in front of Lamare's door. I knocked several times. "Come in," she said. I pushed the door and walked inside. She had changed her clothes, and the smell of sweat and sun was gone. Instead, her signature scent of lavender filled the air again, and I had to brace myself not to inhale too deeply. I took another whiff of her smell, something to remember her by as I traveled back to the palace. "I'll be leaving now," I said. "It's been days since I was out of my post, and the Emperor may have my neck for that. Please have a safe ride." A safe ride would mean I have a mount. "I would have to borrow your bay," I said. "Take her," she said. "She isn't mine." I cocked my eyebrows. "I won't be surprised if guards chase me down to the palace now," I said. A smile split her face, but it was there for only a brief moment. I know it's too much to ask, she said hesitantly. But when you see me in the palace. I won't tell a soul, I said. She looked grateful. Goodbye, Dogen. I'll see you when the moons permit it, she said. I hoped that it would be sooner than later. I clenched my fist, thumped it twice on my chest, and bowed. When I caught her eyes, they were surprised at what I had done. I was surprised at myself too. What I did was an ancient sign of fealty towards a lady. Once outside, I quickly mounted the horse and started trotting away. My body was tired from the past day's journey, but I found another source of strength, Lamare. Before the cottage was entirely obscured from my view, I looked back. There was no one outside. The light still seeped from the gaps of Lamare's window. She was probably back to her writing,